Document Farewell to Journalism. Author Citizen Zero of India. Document created September 30th, 2024. Document updated October 19th. The word count 5,395 words. To fellow citizens of India and my readers from around the world. Many of you have known me through my essays and chapter-length op-eds, publishings through the Office of Citizen Zero of India, and previously Vox Olympia magazine over the last 5 years, along with my social media information capsules like the bird wearing the tree of knowledge. As the poet Mahmoud Darwish would say, Palestinian poet, and you've known my mockingbird singers exoriating the political class and military establishments all over the world. And for some lost years before that, of my travelogues from India and Southeast Asia, totaling at over 500,000 words in these last few years alone, typed offline entirely on the screen of a phone, over 150,000 to 200,000 words a year, an average of 500 words a day, bi-weekly 5,000 word chapter length essays, or weekly multi-part op-eds. And believe it or not, nearly all of it had come under the gaze of daily watchful surveillance of the 1984 fascist state and its machines of loving grace, like performing a gladiatorial spectacle for the world watching. And anyway, so, because I have to be getting on by, and there are yet those people among the uneducated or unlettered or non-literary minded, sadly, whom I wish I'd done more to help in the act of a redeemed social condition, and who stand thus most vulnerable to the machinations of wickedness of those others whose hearts are not moved by words either, but evidently threatened by it, and to such a degree as it seems they would employ their every artifice and cunning with stirrings of power, fame, wealth, and brute force to censor, condemn, malign, and persecute the truth speaker and disillusion the truth seeker. and have even shown themselves recently to murder and maim, unleashing batons and bayonets and bullets and bombs as their last desperate means to pummel and vanquish the righteous might of penmanship and attrition of peaceful protesters and peacemakers, raising public opinion against the inertness of silences and non sequiturs of complicity in our societies, being normalized presently against the most grotesque violence of ethnic cleansing, genocides, war crimes, religious pogroms, and crimes against humanity being carried out and live video streamed, making it uniquely indefensible and irrefutable, and to its craven deniers, plainer than a highway billboard or an origami folded napkin on their dinner tables, or window gazing options at their uptown art deco shoe stores or whatever. And yet, neither justice, nor international law, nor retaliatory intervention seems forthcoming from the United Nations of the world and the Security Council, i.e., in referring to Zionist Israel's Nazi-fashion diabolical mass murder of Palestinians first and the Lebanese people thereafter. In brief, having dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs on Gaza, in effect exceeding Hiroshima, Dresden, and London bombardment in World War II, killing over 42,000 Palestinian civilians in local government-confirmed body count, but an estimated 118,000 dead as per on-ground American medical operations, or 200,000 dead as per British Lancet research, with over 100,000 gravely, fatally wounded and mutilated, along with the depopulation displacement of over 3 million civilians overall within only 1 year, and with Palestinian women and children bearing the brunt of these casualties more inordinately than any other war elsewhere or at any other time, emphasizing Israel's state-sponsored ethnic cleansing targeting and Amalek pogroms against Arab Semitic races, while its lobbyists whipped up over $20 billion sops in American arms funding in 2023-2024, added to its 10-year $38 billion deal since 2016, tightening its stranglehold on the USA plutocracy and government, coercing America to re-engage further military campaigns in West Asia, whilst glossing over its past bloodletting over the last 20 years and $6.5 trillion misspending of American taxpayer revenues from those past US-led wars and foreign policy failures, etc. And so, to all those journalists and reporters and bloggers amongst you, bleeding your hearts out with ink and print and images and moving pictures and sound, and in remembrance of our comrades who died in service, especially those 175 Palestinian reporters out of Gaza and 270 or more UN staffers killed, targeted conspicuously, even in their press vests and humanitarian vehicles, by despicable, cowardly Israeli snipers and flying drones, and US Department of Defense's new AI and automated weapons testing upon civilians, to all of whom I wish, if it helps, to my fellow journalists, to stand steadfast and true to facts in reporting against the incredulous illegality of these war operations and the overpowering dismay in our souls. For our resistance cannot be long oppressed, for our uncompromising utterances serves our consciences as human beings, petitioning the world to galvanize against the hubris and complicity of their governments and militaries, and in thus pitting our hearts and brains versus brute force, is the unmistakable sign that our words are the rallying cause for the right side of history ultimately, if not bearing a testament to the end of days. But to be sure that our solidarity begun here remains till eternity, and then may the justice of Mother Earth prevail. Over the past 2.5 years, the news of the brutality of Israel's Gaza genocide and the Russia-Ukraine war has affected nearly everyone, as individuals and as nations, and in some ways has interfered and changed our personal priorities profoundly, that the mind box to take action struck with such a blow to our moral view of the world that we find ourselves as ordinary, conscientious people naturally thrown into protests and non-cooperation and civil disobedience against the bulwark of the elites of our governments, mainstream news media, and corporations, complicit and expedient together, versus our majority popular opinion and our peoples risking the most personal sacrifices, and where our collective selflessness in these matters has become a sort of a spiritual solidarity even, and overall represents two sides responding to the most visceral violence unleashed and relentless live streaming like never before so documented and witnessed in the history of the world, that we cannot but help feel the call for revolution. against the status quo, through which few nations, with their stratocratic military-industrial complexes, seem to perpetuate wars interminably. Every 5, 10, 20 years, as though their voters suffer from classic amnesia of history, that they're easily wound up by recycled war rhetoric and electioneering, that no politician, no world leader these days seem to take risk of talking of peace and disarmament anymore, even as the world has never been closer to DEFCON 1, and leaves the rest of us wishing thus for a new world order, for a braver, juster, equitable, peacefully coexistence of 8 billion people of Earth. And seems to me, with words falling on deaf ears and our minds easily distracted by the razzle-dazzle of internet social media content and propaganda news, and our looming historical illiteracy and whatever else. And so, like a wounded soldier saying farewell to arms, this moment of hopelessness almost feels like a farewell to journalism for myself and probably others too in the world. And so it appears linguists and contenders amongst us, probably wishing to take matters in our own hands, have become litigators, appealing for constitutional remedies, and have taken directly to rallying for new political platforms everywhere. And whilst there are still others seeking a different engagement with words, and they have turned to academia and other ways. And so, pondering at this fork in the road, I wrote the rest of this note about my very brief foray in journalism and where it seems to be going thereafter. Beginning around 2018 and returning to India after my travels in Southeast Asia, I applied myself more effectively into my journalistic writings than before, as my linguistic propensities was most accentuated and accessible to me, even in the onset of a certain frugality of personal comforts from my current workplace disability, having left my job in 2014. And its talent became marvelous and clear and rational and flowing. And I no longer doubted myself as a writer, nor stagnated, nor struggled as hard as I had in the past, nor did I feel clueless and intimidated as to what I would be writing in the future. And most wonderfully surprising was that it was not just words, by which English language had been the mainstay of my vocabulary and the language of my thoughts and writing and technical knowledge. But with a certain new mind, I felt more attuned to sound, the sound made by words more than the meaning of words. And from this attribute became a meditative retreat and an unhurried passage of time to be able to access old Indian languages now. And from out of that bright blue sky one afternoon on the terrace, listening to Sanskrit shlokas, I visualized the shape of letters coming to me. And very soon, I relearned the Devanagari alphabet and to spell out the sounds I was hearing into writing. And I was overjoyed, knowing myself to have been a very poor and frightened student in school taking exams in Indian languages. And within a year, at the time of the COVID-19 lockdown, (2020-21), I had memorized some 3 to 4 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita Upanishads and copied it over in writing from the reference. Without approaching these verses academically then, I found myself tantalized by the mnemonics and the arrangement of sounds and the syllables of words in old Indian languages that seems to fuse itself to memory most naturally. And thereafter, and it is not surprising because Indian languages were originally officially transmitted orally for nearly a millennia before setting it down into writing. Thereafter, I found an even greater joy in the reading of 8th and 10th century Old Kannada works, which happens to be my mother language, my mother tongue. Works of epic Mahabharata, reimagined by poets as Pampa and Ranna. And I knew I wanted to devote some part of every day in my life to these discoveries thereafter. What's more, by the end of 2021, I had worked out from the sounds in the verses that it was Sanskrit from around 1000 BC that had borne true etymological origins of English or Germanic languages. Example, in the first chapter of the Gita alone, I had gathered new Sanskrit roots for some 50 common English words. Whereas Oxford and Webster's dictionaries still largely attributed the etymology of these words to Old German in 7th century AD or Anglo-French in 12th century AD, deriving from Latin and Greek equivalents. And this made me think that the British colonization of India was rather a kind of an Oedipus tragedy. And somehow, this civilizational error had manifested in our own lives in many ways as subjects of previous colonies. And because these miscommunications had seemed a very stumbling factor in the ensemble of events, anyway, for me, these scriptures in old languages and incantations I started to access held no interest as religious matters whatsoever, but entirely for its sounds, languages, and linguistic possibilities for the poetics of the mind. I was just as likely to be captivated by Persian and Arabic out of West Asia, with whom Indian history, trade, commerce, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and language bears relations going back many millennia, even before the spread of Islam. And similarly for Urdu, the language used by many of our Muslim brothers and sisters in India. I previously attempted passing some Hebrew too, from travelers I met in their India sojourns. In the past, I knew some French after my college years and little Spanish from living in America. There had always been the magical allure of Greek mythology that I was interested in, and the co-evolution of Greek and Sanskrit phonetic languages, and not to mention Greece and the Ionian transfusion in recorded Indian history. In passages of recorded Indian history, early passages. In abusing the complexity of Chinese languages, I wondered how Mandarin and Cantonese, I wondered how I might ever differentiate such a wide representation of characters. Or perhaps I might enjoy painting Japanese signboards or something. And how of its conjugations in speech, and how we may communicate directly for better relations between our peoples and our nations. And then I felt like wanting to learn and revive African languages in speech, as well as in formal education, which in reading the story of the blues music, I came to understand of how African slaves brought to America in 17th to 19th centuries were forced into silences by isolation, physical tortures, and politically and religiously thereafter, so as to make them forget their old African tongues entirely. Knowing that without traditionally evolved forms of communication with each other, their oppressors could thwart means of their escape and rebellion, and rather keep them as slaves and in a state of childish dependency for a long time. And in the same manner, with Native Americans and the natives of South America, of the Aztecs, Incas, Quechuas, Amazonians, Mexicans, and so many others were subjugated and persecuted under Spanish and Portuguese colonizations to a state of forgetfulness of their true selves. And in this way, from language to impress customs in society and protocols in governments presently, in ways that those nations who deemed themselves custodians of languages could establish an international framework of rules or laws to keep the rest of us beholden to it, while through the sophistry of words they could get away with a different set of rules. And so on, in the grand scheme of geopolitics, translating this misadvantage for reneging treaties, resolutions, lawful obligations, and joint peace agreements, whilst enabling illegal wars, defending the continued use of brutal force by themselves, leaving peacemakers behind to be engaged in fighting public opinion wars against the bulwark of mainstream news media institutions, manufacturing consent for the might of corporate, military, and political elites, and so on. This chaotic arrangement had spread under the guise of political correctness, civility, and reasonable discourse, despite proving counter-conclusive to our traditional, long-held native instincts for self-preservation and peaceful coexistence. And nowadays, subjected to a further state of bamboozlement and powerlessness, in our being wheedled out of the ownership of our digital data and internet rights by the whims of a few foreign big tech corporations, etc. All of this application of a new state of mind to forms of communication had been self-taught to me, by me, needing no academic privileges, religious qualifications, or caste denominations, etc. that's associated with ceremonial languages usually, and especially because it had been opened up to me as an English-educated Indian. I postulated, therefore, it would rightly be even more accessible to everyone else, being primarily native language speakers. And it just needed ourselves to retrieve our minds back from the dreary desert sands of dead habit into the clear stream of reason. And its benefits were beyond just language and independence of thought, but from it, political liberty itself. But I found that the social milieu in India, also hurtling towards a dangerous failed state republic at present, and was not at all conclusive for such intellectual high-mindedness, that any such linguistic or philosophical renaissance was liable to be perverted by the current Hindutva fascism in politics and society, and they would subvert it into some kind of mass voodoo psychosis of ritualism, religiosity, caste elitism, right-wing revisionist school curriculums, North Indian cultural and political hegemony of Hindi, Hindutva, and Hindustan, violence against minority communities, coaxing citizens to become placid and dumb, an insular moral ambiguity of our societies where all life is sacred, but not human life, of a voluntary disempowerment of the Constitution and the infringement of our rights and liberties and secularity to the whims of religious demagogues and elected offices, a mobocracy of ever-expanding majority of legislators charged with criminal records, framing laws for the rest of our citizenry. Of the mismanagement of our public offices, social security and welfare state, of crony capitalists usurping and monopolizing our nation's resources, of corruption of dark wealths at every level of society, of police brutality against political opponents and dissenters, of the general historical myopia from our bad educations, the logic, reason, facts, scientific thinking has been crowded out of our mind spaces by superstitions, cheaply accessible celluloid, sports and entertainment, propaganda news, scandals, tabloids, and it is not dissimilar from the gladiatorial spectacles in ancient Rome used to distract the masses at the times of tyranny. And so scrolling and swiping our phone screens suffused with waves of fanatical indoctrination by the political classes or communication mediums, like some mass hysteria of dumb fratricidal monkeys, as in the opening scene of The Dawn of Man in 2001 Space Odyssey, the movie, where we seem oblivious to the most incomprehensible technological advancement of our times, of the sickly continuation of religious and caste silos, separations, and segregations in our society, of labor exploitations, of disempowerment of poor and voting electorates, of overall male chauvinism, suppressed sexuality and gender relations, patriarchal subjugation of women, and no less of their own misogynies towards each other, and of all manner of self-loathing for their sorority's progress for women's liberation and leadership. Justice and equality in the world, in our nations, of child labor, an abysmal dropout rate in our schools, deadening our children's minds from TV and social media, of dietary misconceptions, hunger and malnutrition, of sickening consumerism based on purchase power parity rather than knowledge power parity or know-how for production of capital, for energy and technological independence, of the defederalization and aggrandization of powers within central fascist unitary state, or those postulating greater foreign expansions upon mytho-historical claims, and worse yet, undermining our nation's sovereignty from distant foreign interferences, warning of a new kind of divide and rule colonization from our dependency on foreign communications, surveillance, technologies, and weapons supplies, in much the same way as the 17th, 18th century Indian feudal princes of the subcontinent had resorted to hiring British and French militia to carry out their local military campaigns. And so, the current bourgeoisie politics leading our nation astray in the world to the alienation of our continental and historical peers, friends, allies, well-wishers, and the ultimate endangerment to our energy, environmental, financial, and national securities, with the tragic separation of our original relation with nature and biodiversity and natural environment, and its unmitigated degradation under pollution, climate change, and so the noble Brutus did endeavor to brook the tyrant and the eternal devil, to keep one's state in Rome and for human rights in the world as easily constitutionally as the king. He doth know that Brutus would rather be an obscure villager, nowhere known, than be called a son of Rome under these conditions of resurgent fascism and Nazism at our homelands and abroad. It goes on and on this way, O my fellow citizens of India. Forgive me if I should say your people have made me depressive and ill sometimes. The inertness and incommunicability of your hearts. But for my duty to thee, O Republic, is of limited ardor. And as I said, it has been in writing these journalistic essays these last 5 years that sapped my energies, my time, my plans, my priorities, all of which, anyway, these essays, historically summarized, clarified, fact-checked, to remove all confusions to myself, to sharpen our senses, to kill the lies, so that truth and conscience and fight for justice becomes the raison d'etre, the living force that moves us, guides us, and unites us, for clearing of the way to be able to have more exalted thoughts. And so I seek no more than the sight of the sky above. After writing under the encroachment of the most unrelenting surveillance has felt like working on with the chronic discomfort of a tumor in my brain. My own words, therefore, beyond everything else that I can no longer claim my privacy or ownership to, but just these words, have been the very utterance of my soul, crushed by the weight of its own great expectations for the more perfect union, higher aspirations for the more perfect citizenry, and for peace on earth unto the very end. And at the end of it, it seems, India has become to me somewhat the most friendless and loveless place in the whole wide world, which can only be the most cursed thing I could ever bear every day. Apart from these levels of dystopian surveillance upon a writer's mind and other unconstitutionalities. Everything I so turn away now is towards the solipsistic, selfish, and self-centered, as compared to obligations to the memory of the generational leaps my grandfather and my mother had crossed from their obscure, meager beginnings from nowhere to the toil of the land and of their great sacrifices for the independence of our country and public service in their lifetimes, and of the wholesome education they could afford for me, and of a somewhat princely nurturing even, and the astonishing, progressive, Gandhian, secular upbringing that was enshrined within our entire extended family, despite our largely rural nativity. And then growing up in our family house, built in the first decades of Indian independence years, embracing the lofty high ideal of the noble mansion of free India, where all her children may dwell. It appears now that much of that good is past and romanticized in my memories, and my heroes are long departed and long gone from the world, and the more I venerate them in this current society and its fascist politics, and I find myself relegated with them to the realms of living ghosts and the walking dead. It has therefore somewhat helped to be the kind of an underachiever, idiot savant, as I know myself to be. And in a way, it's freeing as well for a writer, especially when one aims to write the stuff that's remembered for a couple of thousand years, or to be remembered as an inspirer, instigator, and influencer of revolution. But just who here, or what national obligations can presently entice me to assure such legacy? And of those great poets and writers, there have always been those equally who had benefited from the patronage of kings in the times, as those banished from the native lands as well. More than money and powers that I may or may not have, it is with these writings I have given and lavished my countrymen with the best that I have, the most precious essence of my soul that I previously only gave to special people in my life. It has been a labor of love wasted on fools. Yet not unlike Plato's philosopher from the allegory of the cave, I had seen the light, and I returned to inform my compatriots in chains of these matters of shadows and substances. Therefore, I've foreseen the denouement for being regarded a madman in their judgments, and it bothers me not. For a person is only as wise as the company he keeps, and my company has been books lately, or for my childhood, and for being made a loner in my native lands. Somewhere out there in the great distance between us are a people awaiting who regard me, a friend and sympathizer, whose well-being fills up my waking thoughts every day nowadays, even from this distance. Whoever and wherever they are that were oppressed, it will be a blessing indeed to be able to live simply and work amongst those so oppressed and surviving so intense a daily extermination, who seldom in over a century have had any lasting good done unto them, before even that being taken away again or destroyed altogether, who have shown the world what it is to risk and hazard all that they've got in their lives. And so to such people, I likewise stand ready to risk and hazard all that I've got in my life, especially in reference to Palestine, the Palestinian people. Presently, even supposing this show should end here, and I've heard your patronizations and consternations in my emerging as some kind of preeminent political mind of my generation, writing truth to power, as they might say, but for a more peaceful, coexisting, equitable world order. That somehow if I should be made soft to your praise for my literary heroism, and then subservient to your corrupt bourgeoisie political designs, and then to coerce my continued compliance with the current state of unconstitutionalities, including glossing over abuse of authority with mass surveillance, etc., addressed elsewhere. It might be worthwhile to remind ourselves of the Confucian maxim that where nations are ruled by war and chaos, their honors and offices are symbols of a failed state and a failed world order. And if nations claim to be ruled by human rights and reason, then poverty, corruption, crime, unconstitutionality are equally the symptoms of a failed state and a failed world order. And then again, I can only hope my words have been some sort of frames of reference to current affairs in the world and against public ignorance that dooms our nations to repeat history's mistakes. And so I accept no awards either, except posthumously, so that I may not be betrayed by such glories before whatever its deeds be complete, lest I should fall from great expectations and become as those whose deeds turn the opposite of good, for which these awards serve recognition. Of course, I accept cash awards, as these may be useful for practical purposes in helping those who need it more than me and ourselves, as always in the service of India and the still larger cause of humanity. And so, from resolving my personal difficulties, I take some of these pledges by which I may hope to contribute to a redeemed social condition in the world. Firstly, I'm somewhat grateful to the people of my country, my fellow Indians, for holding their nerve for this very long, for affording me the luxury of time I needed to articulate my condition of existence and to address any troubles stirred up from my words or actions gone wrong, and for not erupting into major civilian conflagration as we never should, nor endangering the unity and integrity of our nation, to foreign interference and foreign internet communication mediums. As such would have been likely in any other less tolerant and reactive societies. And so, I can say that though I have not yet found the freedom of heart to enjoy the kind of love and friendship that endears a person to a place and its people, and I don't know where I may find it eventually, but I'm certain to have benefited from a great degree of freedom of thought and speech in my country, in India, without restrictions or reservations and expressions of all forms of social, political satire, criticism, cynicism, irreverence, irreligiousness, immorality, etc., which is truly in the general tradition of socio-political religious reform movements in our Indian history, from many millennia, going back all the way to the Shakyamuni Buddha, and thereafter with Adi Shankaracharya, the Bhakti movement, and so many more to recall. Wherein dissent and disagreement has not only been tolerated without degrading into barbarities as blasphemy laws, crucifixions, whippings, stonings, witch burnings, etc., seen elsewhere or in some past societies, but also that it accompanies our previous enthusiasm for the right argument and an openness to adopt and adapt to corrections in our philosophical and political standards, but that I'm not certain if I enjoy these freedoms for my privilege as a somewhat recognized public person, or from my natural right as a citizen of India. For there certainly has been reports of great degrees of deterioration, infringement and censorship of constitutional rights to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly, as I have experienced too, and as faced by other individual citizens and various sections of the press and authors, and especially amongst our minorities in our Indian society. And I wish to extend to all such persons and groups my Voltairean defense and representation of their views within the Constitution of India, and unwavering support for maintenance of the full and inalienable rights and liberties. Whereas the other extreme obstruction to freedom of speech the whole world seems to be experiencing is seen from the cowardly and brazen apathy, stonewalling, and inertness of elected governments in power, bureaucracies, mainstream news media corporation, to the extent of outright unconstitutionality and ultimate breakdown of the international law and order framework against the tireless goading of truth, facts, evidence, conscience, consensus, and popular opinion. And so, as the saying goes, hell is the impossibility of reason. And that's where the governments around the world have now led us to. In this strange hour of civilizations in the 21st century, it is useful to remember that when FDR, the American president, Roosevelt, said, "There's nothing to fear but fear itself," I'm certain he meant the willfully pernicious ability of those in authority and positions of power to drive the masses to doubts and fears. And seen in the parlance of the times over the last 20 years, it has been relentless wars and strife, leaving millions dead in the world and misspending trillions of dollars. One can say that in corollary, there is nothing more terrorizing about terrorism than politicians terrorizing voters about terrorism. And from it, as the other saying goes, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hatred is the cause of all suffering. And so, the state of war exists in the world perpetually. And so, secondly, in expressing my solidarity with refugees, victims of war, displaced, besieged persons, persons facing unlawful arrest, prolonged detentions by militaries, police, and other administrative authorities all over the world, especially with regards to the conditions of the millions of Palestinians, people of Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem, brutalized and displaced by Israel's ethnic cleansing, depopulation, siege, occupation, and genocide, the active support of a politically emasculated and fiscally compromised American government, and from the senseless US-led wars in the rest of West Asia previously, and in solidarity with persons peacefully abiding as undocumented immigrants facing deportation on account of their religion, race, ethnicity, caste, etc., especially with their children being uprooted from the land of their birth, the government policies and xenophobic laws enacted in their parliaments, including in my own country, India, presently, until all such persons are resettled in their permanent homes, shelter from the storms and a roof over their heads, that I too, on leaving my residence, and refuge, my ancestral home, house, of the abode of the Shiva, I have steadfastly determined to refuse to take residence in any other house or lodgings, wherever in the world I may find myself to be, except requesting I be granted use of temporary camping ground, kitchen, and washroom facilities, etc. Thirdly, having emphasized in my essays, social media posts and appeals to the United Nations, member states, national labor organizations, and the Government of India, the nature of the cause for the liberty and rights of the Palestinian people in securing their sovereign independent state of Palestine, free from Israeli occupation and illegal settlements based on the 1967 borders, and in recognizing the century-old Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism by Israel as one akin to the Indian struggle for independence from British colonialism, especially since the time of Mahatma Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's leadership in the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements, and the struggle against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, akin to the struggle of native South Africans under Madiba Nelson Mandela against oppression and segregation by white apartheid regimes, and in upholding India's recognition of the Palestinian statehood in 1988, including political recognition and support for Abu Amr, Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization since 1974, and in concurrence with the foreign policy framework established by Article 51 Directive Principles of State Policy of Constitution of India, and in asserting India's long-held affirmation for a permanent two-state solution for a peaceful coexistence of republics of Israel and Palestine, and in opening an independent investigation inquiry into Israeli military's war crime murder of the former Indian Army officer and UNDSS official Colonel Kale, and in concurrence with all UN General Assembly, Security Council and International Court of Justice resolutions till date to these effects, affirming the state of Palestine and its territories, and the independence of its territories, because there is no other worthier purpose for my journalistic endeavors remaining than documenting the Palestinian question. I request the Government of India and the State of Palestine and all other concerned UN bodies to provide me with diplomatic credentials as a UN Special Rapporteur and Peace Volunteer to Gaza and other occupied Palestinian territories of West Bank and East Jerusalem, without which I would be obligated to risk my own life in joining the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, of which I seek the support of fellow volunteers, among fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, grandfathers and grandmothers, of my country. The men and women of India, my fellow compatriots of Asia, Africa, Latin America, to join me and march together through a world broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls towards Gaza, and join in the cause for liberation of Palestine and its people from illegal Israeli occupation. Peace, peace, peace. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. Shanti. Thank you and farewell. The Mahatma Gandhi Nation forever. Vande Mataram. Jai Hind.